Okay, welcome back everyone. We're going to take a look at some more work by Aristotle. It is 11/24 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the Eudaimonian ethics, another branch of the Nicomachean ethics, which we've already studied by Aristotle. But the Eudaimonian ethics gives us a little bit different perspective and a little bit of additional information for the Aristotle ethics. We're going to take a look at it in the following moments of aletheia truth, agathos good, the praxis as aim, the praxis as means, and then the realm of spirit as a teleology and the dedication of the community to that teleology. So we'll end with the community of the church. We're going to begin with truth and the good, the notion of the true and the practical wisdom of the good, which is that which we learn from the Nicomachean ethics. So that begins the same way in the Eudaimonian ethics. But we'll begin with the aletheia truth, or the good in itself as the good per se. And it encloses three primary categories for Aristotle: the intellective, the sentient, and the practical. It is eschatological in nature, depicting a teleosis. And there are three corresponding modalities, and those modalities correspond to his doctrine of the soul. We've got the intellective, the sentient, and the practical. Now, the acquisition of the good takes place at the docunta threshold of dialogue, where we engage in dialogue with others toward that acquisition of the eidos forms. And therefore it is a dialogue with others through philosophical argument. It is percept-based, consisting of n-doxa agreement on the eidos forms and a-doxa disagreement on the eidos forms. Now, this ethic is going to be mediated through phronesis, or it's going to be mediated through practical wisdom. So the notion of the true needs to pass through the practical in order to become ethics. And it'll be a practical wisdom that is going to be a teleosis or a teleology. It will articulate a kinesis or a movement through change, a teleosis of a change. And it'll be an ethic within our range of action. And the percepts are grasped with regard to the eidos form, the participation of the sentient thing, and the separable abstract signification that we draw out of the sentient realm. In other words, the eidos forms are presented to us through the sentient realm, but we abstract out the eidos forms of signification. And the eidos form will include substance as mind, the quality of justice, and the quantity as the middle or the mean of the extremes. Those all will be included along with the intentionality that the sentient thing also contains in the signate attributes that it also contains as its essence. So sentient things are presented to us. Within the sentient things, there is the presence of the eidos form of universality, and the eidos form of universality is the substance of the universal, which is veiled by the sentient attributes or the sentient accidents, but the universal substance is the eidos form. Now, the supreme good in note 6 lies beyond every eidos form. So the eidos forms are the universal aspect of individual things, but the collective of the eidos forms is abbreviated under a supreme genus of the supreme eternal good. So the universal genus abbreviates our politics as action, the ideality of the eidos forms, and the practical prudence of our enacting of the ideality as a practical ethic. All of that becomes abbreviated under the universal supreme good. There is the overarching genus of the supreme eternal good for Aristotle that is foundational for every eidos form, and even when the eidos forms are arranged in an interrelated sign model, that sign model is a projection and a representation of the supreme eternal good, which is the foundational genus. So for Aristotle, we begin with the true. We don't just launch off into the good and into ethics. We begin with the intellective soul, and the intellective soul is busy examining the presentations of the sentient soul and grasping the eidos forms of universality as signs of signification. Then we transition into the good. In block 2, the good is the good going out of itself as an act of existence. So now we're going to transition into ethics, and it begins as a 3-stage process of the prudence of the phronesis of practical wisdom, the enlisting of the habits of virtue as the principles of our ethics, and the goal of individual pleasantness or pleasure for our particular praxis. So when we get into ethics, we really do get into a 3-stage process of transitioning out of the ideal true, the notion of the true. We begin with practical wisdom, virtuous principles, and a very particular praxis act. So note 2, the phronesis of practical wisdom is called by Aristotle the existential waking. It is the existential waking up out of the notion of the true. The self begins by waking the practical soul in order to apply the truth that the intellective soul has acquired. So there's an existential waking up to the need to go out of the self as practical. It is existential waking. It is waking as practical, but then note B, it's waking as identity, because we also wake to the goal of achieving an excellence of identity that addresses the 5-step encomium, which includes our birth, upbringing, our individual actions, our comparison of qualities, and then the epilogue or the conclusion concerning identity. So the process of ethics is not just involved in bettering the world or bettering history. It's also about self-identity and appropriating the proper definition for what does it mean to be a human being. It is a waking to identity as well as a waking to a teleosis. Now see, it is a waking as commanding, because our practical wisdom is supposed to formulate a generic principle of virtue in order to incline and persuade the appetite of the will to obey. So practical wisdom creates a generic state of virtue, or a principle of virtue, which will affect and influence our appetite of the will in order to enact the act of existence. Now, the principle of virtue will exist as a state or a faculty, a state of virtue based on the habits of virtue. And the commanding is conceptualized under the self's category of character. So it becomes kind of a synonymous with our character. We are defined, our character is defined by the habits of virtue, which we enclose within the self, which we have developed. Our habits of virtue define our character and influence the way that our appetite of will enact our act of existence. It gives us a little bit of a little triad at the bottom of block 2. So we can see that we're going to begin with the aletheia truth of the notion of the true. The intellective soul stirs the self to become awakened. So this notion of the true from the eidos forms stirs us up to be awakened to the practical. So block 2, the agathos good, is held by the practical soul, and it constructs a practical wisdom that wakes up. And then we move into block 3, the praxis act of existence, which is held by the appetite of the will that obeys the state of virtue. So these first 2 moments deal with the ideality of the notion of the true from the eidos forms, and then the practical notion of the good that practical wisdom, or phronesis, acquires. So you've got aletheia, truth, and agathos, good, through practical wisdom that join together to move on to ethical act. Ethical act is praxis. Praxis equals action and reflection within history. That's the Greek definition. It's action and reflection within history. So what we want to do is take a look at praxis next and see how this aletheia, truth, and this practical wisdom of the good are combined in order to move us onward toward actualizing the appetite of the will in praxis, in action and reflection in history. And that's going to be blocks 4, 5, and 6. We're going to look at the praxis aim and the praxis means, and then we'll move on to the realm of the spirit. So we'll take a look at the block 4 next. Okay, let's take a look at block 4, and we're going to look at the good as the act of existence, or the praxis aim. It is a voluntary act of a choice that unites desire as the desire of the sentient passions, and the doxa, opinion, based on deliberation of practical phronesis. We deal with instrumentality. The eschatological end of the absolute good is already fixed. We already desire the absolute eternal good, but we now needed to deliberate on the practical aim and the practical means of acquiring the absolute eternal good. So we end up with note 3, doxa plus passion. The phronesis of the practical wisdom in the second block, which is based on the true eidos forms, makes up our doxa practical opinion, which will be coupled with the passions that we want to bring into obedience to reason in order to create our choice. So the act of existence becomes, for Aristotle, a movement. Note 4, our act equals a movement of the eidos forms as principles of movement. So once we transition out of the notion of the true and into a very practical phronesis wisdom and a practical act of praxis, we get into forms that are no longer things. Now forms become principles, the eidos forms become principles of movement and ethics. They become principles of movement. And note B, that movement is in accord with the logos reason, and it is a movement of instrumentality where truth and good have already been worked on. Now we move on to the actualization of the truth and the good. And it requires a reasoning and a perception at a very specific historical praxis level. So we now have acquired our very particular practical aim for our ethics, and now we need the practical means for our ethical act. We've got the general practical wisdom, we've got the precise practical aim, and now we need the precise practical means in block 5. So if we look at block 5, we've got a summary of the previous moment, which we see in note A. Continence is the abstaining from the passions, which will preserve our praxis aim through the sentient passions being obedient to reason. Now the state of virtue and the habits of virtue are that which create the practical wisdom and our practical aim. The habits of virtue help us to keep our sentient passions in check and help us to shape that wisdom into a very practical aim of ethics. Now we transition from absolute good to the good for the individual, and we're going to get 7 steps here. The habits of virtue must mediate again, and pleasantness or pleasure becomes an additional object, not just the noble good. The noble good and the pleasure for the individual can only be synthesized through the concept of active love for Aristotle. And active love is a reciprocity between the good and pleasure. So the character trait that encloses this active love is the habit of friendship. So when we get down to the actual practical act of our ethics, it's one of a habit of friendship. And we adopt the very familiar axiom from Christianity, love the other as a self. Love the neighbor as a self. And this is strengthened by the confidence through time and trial. So for Aristotle, praxis aim and praxis means can now be synthesized and enter into the realm of the spirit. Praxis aim plus praxis means equals realm of the spirit as an action of the love of the neighbor. In other words, there's going to be a realm of spirit which involves community. And community will be addressed in Block 6. Now in Block 6, you'll notice that we're looking at teleosis, or the teleology of this entire process of truth passing through practical wisdom to reach the praxis of the good. And it also equals philoponeo, which is the dedication of the self to this teleosis. So in the realm of the spirit, we live according to the pleasure of virtue. Pleasure and virtue are involved in a reciprocity within community. This partnership rests on justice, as in the absolute good, and justice always involves a relationship of partners. And so Aristotle talks about the equity of partnership. The act of existence results in the giving of existence in return. When we go out of ourselves in praxis in order to create, there's always a return of existence. And that return is called the return of honor, and it's where the ideal is reaffirmed within the fellowship and the community. So basically, what Aristotle tells us is that we're going to begin with the eidos forms representing the universal true. We're going to arrange them into a sign model of the ideal true. But then we want to transition, we're awakened into needing to transition to the practical, into going out of ourself and achieving the absolute good. Truth transitions to the good. To do that, we have to enter into praxis, which is action and reflection within history. We take that practical wisdom. In the second moment, we have to develop a very precise praxis aim and a very precise praxis means, all based on our habits of virtue, and that will lead us to the realm of the spirit. But once in the realm of the spirit, we get involved in community. We get involved in a community that seeks equity and justice. And every time we go out of ourselves in praxis action, there's an expansion of the truth. There's an expansion of practical wisdom concerning the good. There's an expansion of newly unveiled ideas, newly unveiled eidos forms. And so there's a return of existence. We internalize that, and we instruct each other in fellowship and reaffirm our ideality. So the entire process for Aristotle is a movement of eidos forms, and they become transfigured. They become eidos forms that become eidos principles of movement, that become eidos praxis aims and eidos praxis means, and then they become eidos forms that serve justice and serve community. So it gives us a tremendous look at Aristotle's Eudaimonian ethics, which really just emphasizes the ultimate well-being, which doesn't really differ from the Nicomachean ethics. It just emphasizes different aspects of that same ethics. And that'll wrap up the Eudaimonian ethics from Aristotle.